I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
I wanted to spend a little bit of time on at least two Federalist papers. As you know, I guess the Maurin Academy have been pretty critical of liberal theory, but liberal theory is the basis of the U.S. Constitution, so I think it's important for people to know what that is, and I think Federalist 10 and 51 are good places to start. So Federalist 10 was written by James Madison. Madison, Hamilton, and Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, with Hamilton writing the most and Madison second. And they were to argue for the new Constitution, which now is the Constitution we still have today. And what I thought I would do is read it, and when I find necessary or useful, to comment and explain. So this was written in November of 1787 to the people of the state of New York. Madison writes, "Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction." So faction is the problem at hand. Factions, violent factions that threaten to overturn public order. So he goes on, "The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. Republics have a problem with factions. It is a dangerous vice." He says, "He will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it, for faction. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have in truth been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished." And just to be clear, popular governments means kind of democracies, basically republics. "As they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declamations. The valuable improvements made by the American constitutions on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much admired. But it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have as effectually obviated the danger on this side as was wished and expected." Okay, part of the problem with the Federalist Papers is that the language at this point in time is somewhat antiquated and maybe uses too many big words, so to speak. But basically what he's saying there is that there's a big danger in wishful thinking when people in a liberal democracy don't think about the dangers of factions, violent factions, and what to do about them. So he goes on, "Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of the public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. So here he's saying that one big complaint against democracies is that too often they are basically run over by majority parties, and they're too unstable, and there's a lot of jockeying and power grabbing back and forth, and the rights of minorities, political and religious, can be trampled upon. This is a danger of democracies because democracies are always supposed to be rule of the majority. Okay, so he goes on. However anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts will not permit us to deny that they are indeed in some degree true. It will be found indeed on a candid review of our situation that some of the distresses under which we labor have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments. But it will be found at the same time that other causes will not alone account for many of our heaviest misfortunes, and particularly for that prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements and alarm for private rights, which are echoed from one end of the continent to the other. These must be chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with which a factious spirit has tainted our public administrations. They were concerned about how much quarreling and fighting and factiousness was going on within the various states in the previous constitution that was not very well unified under a national government. And so then he defines faction. He says, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether accounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So a faction, in other words, he's saying, can be a minority, but can also be a majority. And what makes them a faction is that they are united and activated by this common passion that is adverse to the rights of other citizens. It's their passion. And what he's trying to get at is that a faction doesn't think about the common good, about the good of the whole union, but just of the good of their particular passion, what unites it. And this threatens to disturb the overall unity. So he says there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction, the problems of faction. The one method is by removing its causes, removing the causes of factions, and the other is by controlling its effects, controlling the effects of factions. Okay. And then he says again, there are two methods of removing the causes of factions. So he's first going to look at, can we remove the very cause of factiousness within democracies to where people become either a majority or minority that is so activated by a particular passion that they can become destructive? Can we remove the cause of that? There are two methods of removing the causes of faction, he says. The one is by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, and the other is by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. So here Madison is saying, if you want to remove the cause of faction entirely and never risk having a faction develop, then you can do two things. You can get rid of people's freedom and basically get rid of democracy, because democracy is a breeding ground for faction, which would mean like moving to some sort of authoritarian type of state, a dictatorship, or in his mind, like, a kingship with absolute sovereignty. And the other method is to somehow give all the citizens, short of that, the same opinions. So not likely, but anyway. So he says, it could never be more truly said then of the first remedy, that it is worse than the disease. Yes, so to get rid of democracy entirely and move to an authoritarian system is, in his opinion, worse than risking the causes and the disputes of factions. He says, liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an element without which it instantly expires, but it could not be a less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish to annihilate the air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive energy. Okay, so we can't do this. In other words, we can't have like a political life at all. And so Madison here kind of echoes Aristotle's view that man is a political animal, and that what allows human beings to flourish fully is when they govern their own affairs and when they're capable of, deliberating together for the common good. And therefore, if we get rid of that, if we get rid of the freedom with which to do that kind of deliberation and engage in politics, then we are basically becoming less human. And that is worse than risking to have this problem of faction. And then he says, still talking about getting rid of the causes, he says, the second expedient or method is impractical as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, continues to be weak and, capable of mistakes, as long as our reason continues to be fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between man's reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. Well, here he's saying, if you want to make everybody think the same way, that's impossible because our opinions and our passions are connected, and we can't totally control our passions. Humans have reason, but they also have passion, and they're very diverse. They go after different things, and therefore, to try to make everybody think the same, authoritarian governments try it, but we find that nobody succeeds in doing this, and that actually breeds like underground factions, so it's impossible. He says the diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interest. Here he's saying that, people's different occupations are partly what cause their like factiousness, their difference of opinions. If you're a farmer, you live a very different life than if you're a worker in a city. If you're an occasional worker, that's different from being a permanent worker in a factory. Or, if you are a landlord, your experience is going to be very different. And so the differences in what we do with what, quote, property or lack thereof we have is going to make us and our passions very different. So that's going to create opinions that are different. He says the protection of these faculties is the first object, the first aim of government. The protection of these faculties, these various ways of making a living, especially having to do in his mind with property, is one of the first objects. It's the first object of government, he says. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence on these on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors, owners of property, ensues a division of the society into different interests and parties. Yeah, so like there's a little bit of his economic theory coming out. The government is there in a very fundamental way in this system to protect private property, but the types of private property creates different types of jobs and different worldviews, and the government is there to protect that. One of the outcomes of that is a difference of opinion, and that's just kind of inevitable. All right. So then he continues on. He says, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. The cause of faction is embedded in our very nature. And we see the latent causes of faction everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal or enthusiasm for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as the speculation as of practice. An attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided man into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, okay, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So here Madison is just, speaking to the sort of like the tragedy or irony of human beings trying to do politics together. We, because of how we are, attach ourselves to different religions, to different political leaders, to different business leaders, and we then go about doing a lot of vexing each other, which is to argue and to attack each other, instead of cooperating for the common good. And the common good should be the aim of politics, but it's, difficult, if not impossible, for even a small group to continue to think about the common good consistently. So he's expressing a strong sort of this is a tragic situation that human beings deal with. He says, so strong is this propensity or aptitude, you might say, of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. People will argue, he's saying there that people will argue over the most ridiculous small things too. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinctive interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, that is a landowner, a manufacturing owner interest, a mercantile or merchant interest, a moneyed interest, financier, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes. He's talking there about economic classes, a big source of factions, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests form the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. Okay, so one of government's chief priorities in legislation involves trying to deal with all of these different interests based on how and where people make money. All right, so then he says, no man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause because his interest would certainly bias his judgment and not improbably corrupt his integrity. We can't have people going around judging their own case and taking justice on for themselves to do, to correct the wrongs that they feel. With equal, nay, he says, with equal, nay, with greater reason, a body of men are unfit to be both judges and parties at the same time. Yet, what are many of the most important acts of legislation, but so many judicial determinations, not indeed concerning the rights of single persons, but concerning the rights of large bodies of citizens? And what are the different classes of legislators, but advocates and parties to the causes which they determine? Is a law proposed concerning private debts? It is a question to which the creditors are parties on one side and the debtors on the other. Justice ought to hold the balance between them, yet the parties are and must be for themselves the judges, and the most numerous the party, or in other words, the most powerful faction must be expected to prevail. Shall domestic manufacturers be encouraged And in what degree? By restrictions on foreign manufacturers. Are questions which would be differently decided by the landed and the manufacturing classes, and probably by neither, with a sole regard to justice and the public good. The apportionment of taxes on the various descriptions of property is an act which seems to require the most exact impartiality, yet there is perhaps no legislative act in which greater opportunity and temptations are given to a predominant party to trample on the rules of justice. Every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved to their own pockets. All right, here he's talking about how even within democratic legislatures, you get the factions reflected in society are going to be reflected in the legislature. The various legislators are going to represent in their areas these different factions, and even in their own persons. They may be property owners of one kind or another, and they have different interests than others, and then they're representing their people, and they will represent the predominant faction within their area. So, the legislative solution is not a perfect solution, basically. Removing direct decisions from these groups and placing them in the legislature is not the solution. The legislature still reflects, and this would be the case, especially if the legislature is predominant and really the only decision-making body in the state. And this is foreshadowing the need for the separation of powers and checks and balances. But anyway, then Madison says, it is vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, nor in many cases can such an adjustment be made at all, without taking into view indirect and remote considerations, which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest with which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another or the good of the whole. All right, so here he's just saying again, we can't expect our leaders to be like Gandhi or Buddha or Socrates or King Solomon, and to always rise above the factiousness of their own constituents or themselves. And in fact, these Gandhi, Buddha, Solomon-like leaders are very, very rare. So we can't count, in other words, on somehow having wise leaders that are benevolent, because that's, not easy to find. It's very rare. All right, and I'm not going to be able to do the whole thing today, so I'm going to take this in parts, but I'll do like a couple more paragraphs here. Madison says the inference to which we are brought, that is what he's saying, we should conclude from this, is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling their effects. Maybe I'll stop with that, because that's the first part of his argument, okay? We have concluded from all of this that, okay, factions are a huge problem. Majority and minority factions are a huge problem within a society with any freedom. We want freedom, but these are the tragic consequences of freedom. We can't look to benevolent leaders in the legislature or beyond to always be there to sort this out like King Solomon. And therefore, we must conclude that there is nothing to be done at the root cause of faction, because if we were to stamp out the root cause, which is freedom itself, we would be miserable. We don't want that. So Madison is trying to find a way to have freedom for everybody in a society, while not having one party or minority, violent minority, either one, stomping on the rights of other people. And he has ruled out getting rid of freedom. So in the next part, he's going to deal with what else you can do, controlling its effects, the effects of faction. So next time, as I move on through Federalist paper number 10 by James Madison, I'll deal with that second part. What are the ways that we can think of to remove or control the effects of factions? All right. Hope this is useful.